been music in the New Testament, but there's a parenthetical part to this, and how those references have influenced church music, Christian church music over the years. Because actually, the simple truth of the matter is, there's not that much music in the New Testament. It's only mentioned 43 times. And 15 of the 27 books of the New Testament have no reference to music whatsoever. But first, we kind of need to talk about Jewish music at the time of Jesus. And this is just a very basic overview. But the Jews, there were a lot of Jewish groups in Palestine which had a very restrained attitude about music. In other words, there wasn't much music going on in the synagogues. In a lot of synagogues, they believed it was probably just a cantor singing unaccompanied. And part of this was that they were avoiding lavish music for a couple of reasons. They were surrounded by pagan cultures, but what we call pagan cultures, but other religions, usually with multiple gods, that had temples to those gods. And a lot of those temples had very lavish music display during the services and the tributes to those gods. So they associated lavish music with what they saw with polytheistic cultures around them. And the Jewish sources we have from the period, there's a writer named Philo of Alexandria who lived at the time of Jesus. And he was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher. He was kind of one of those figures who was trying to combine the really popular Hellenistic Greek philosophy of the day with Jewish thinking. There's, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been discovered over the last few centuries, and various rabbinic teachings. And a lot of these look on music a little bit like St. Augustine did, and a little bit like Calvin did. And that is that music distracts us from our attention to God. It's just too nice, it's like having too much wine or too much of something else that is considered worldly. The opulent liturgical display of music was taking place in the temple, and that was something that was adopted by the Sadducees. We talk about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And the Sadducees, they were wealthy. They also controlled the temple worship at the time. Because they were wealthy, obviously, if there was a revolution in Palestine, they would lose more than most people. So they tended to side themselves with the ruling Romans. At least some of them did. And that's why they were considered corrupt by a lot of Jews, because they associated themselves with Rome, and because they wanted opulent music, that was part of the corrupt Sadducee lifestyle. So there were a lot of Jews who were kind of trying to move away from that. So there was an emphasis on vocal music, which of course, we still see in synagogue worship today with cantors, although of course in Jewish worship today, they go everywhere from just a cantor all the way to choir, organ, all kinds of things. It is always very dangerous to talk about people in a monolithic way, and you can't do it with Jewish worship today. But often the synagogues where Jesus would have worshiped and where Jesus spoke first would have only had music in the form of a cantor and probably unaccompanied. We don't know that for sure, but it's what scholars who actually have studied this think. This influences early Christian worship because, of course, the early Christians are Jews. And I know we know that intuitively. We have to remember that they would have brought their music traditions into Christian worship with them. Psalms had been used in Jewish worship for, at this point, 1,000 years. So, of course, they become important in early Christian worship as well. So, music doesn't get mentioned a great deal in the New Testament, and it could possibly be because music was kind of looked at sideways as a potentially evil influence by some of the people who were writing the books of the Bible. So music in the New Testament, as I already said, there's 27 books in the New Testament. 15 of them say absolutely nothing about music. There's no mention of the word sing. There's no instruments mentioned. And as we're going to see, what is mentioned is kind of limited. But even in those limited references, we can learn about music in the day and perhaps what some of the people in the New Testament were thinking. This contrasts course greatly with the Old Testament, because the ancient Hebrew writings have rich references to music. And of course, we know the Temple of Solomon had incredible music going on. You have really very little idea what it sounded like, but all you have to do is go through the book of Psalms, and it says, a psalm will say, according to maskil. Well, most scholars believe maskil is a tune. This is the tune you sing it to. And other psalms say with strings, with percussion, with trumpets. We know they were using it. And without a time machine, we'll never know what it really sounded like. Of course, the most references you find in the New Testament are references to the trumpet. And that's because in Revelations, they're blowing trumpets all the time. Often, a trumpet, yes, the trumpet we're talking about is the shofar, which is still the trumpet used in Jewish worship. All you have to do is take a ram's horn, cut off the end, and you've got a hollow trumpet. Trumpets have been made of all kinds of things over the years. We can talk about wooden trumpets in various cultures, like the Aztec culture. We can talk about trumpets made out of metals besides brass, because the machining of brass that makes things like trumpets and trombones today happens, centuries after what we're talking about here. It's really not possible till the 14th, 15th, 16th century to even be making instruments like that. Valves don't come along until 200 years ago. So the trumpet as we know it simply didn't exist. The trumpets were wood. They were conch shells. A conch shell makes a good trumpet. And so does a ram's horn. And while we're at it, well, what's a shofar sound like? Well, I brought something to shofar.
Very good.
It sounds like a trumpet. Pretty good one. Now, the only way to manipulate pitch in that is with your lips. When you blow harder, it'll be an octave higher. You blow harder than that, it'll be an octave and a fifth higher. It operates on the harmonic series, which is a principle of nature, and a lot of people therefore attribute it to God, because it is just something that happens with any sound. But that is what we mean by a trumpet. So don't be thinking about that nice brass trumpet you might have played in high school or later or heard, but you are still hearing an instrument with a distinctive sound, a loud sound. So when we're referring to a trumpet, even 2,000 years ago, we're referring to a distinctive sound that is going to get people's attention. The shofar, of course, is used in Jewish worship. Today it's blown on Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and then Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. As far as I understand, it's not blown in every Jewish service, it's only blown at special times. But before blowing it, there is a prayer. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with commandments, and who has commanded us to hear the voice of the shofar. Now, I don't think you cannot hear the voice of the shofar if you have any hearing whatsoever, but again, that loud, distinctive sound we associate with the voice of God. Important announcements. So in Revelations, it's not surprising we talk about the trumpet sounds. Well, elsewhere in the Bible too. So, professors are systematic and really tiresome. So I have most of the references to music in the New Testament on slides, and I'd like to go through them, which may take the rest of the day and part of next week. Hopefully I will make it interesting for you. But we'll see an awful lot of references to the trumpet. We'll also see other things. We'll tell us about attitudes towards music and how music was used. Some of it very different than what we have today. So Matthew 9. Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and people playing pipes. Now this is the New International Version. They use the word pipes. Others will translate it flute. Flutes are possibly the most ancient instrument known to humankind. They have found, anthropologists have found bones with a hole drilled in it to blow into, and fingering, and holes for fingers on bones that are 40,000 years old. So human beings have been playing flutes for a great deal of time. The word pipe is not specific enough to know anything. It could be referring to a Greek instrument like the aulos, which was actually, it was a reed instrument with two pipes. You could actually play two parts on it by fingering with both hands. But this tells us about the function of these flutes, or whatever it might be. He said, go away, the girl's not dead, but asleep. This is, of course, one of Jesus' familiar miracles. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all that region. I'm not surprised. I suppose a lot of people were surprised that a dead girl got up. But what's important here is the fact that she was dead. The types of flutes in a number of cultures have been associated with mourning. Actually, to be played, I mean, clearly in Palestine at this point, people who played some kind of flute gathered at the house where someone had died. And they played something, who knows what, but what was identified to their ears as mournful music. This is what I mean by function. They're not there to entertain you. They are there to help you mourn. Elsewhere, of course, we read about sackcloth and ashes and rending of garments. These are the way people acted after someone in their family had died. So we're looking at an important function of the flute, or whatever that instrument was. And again, I'm really not sure. It could have been a reed instrument. But it was an instrument that was associated with the customs for mourning. And there's actually a cantata by Johann Sebastian Bach, it's about mourning. It's written, there's a lot of references to the dead in it. And it uses recorders in a very high, ghostly register. Because even in that day, there were still, and I think it was probably because it was a biblical reference, but there were apparently still customs in Germany in the 18th century where flutes were sometimes thought of instruments of mourning. And I'm sure it's that passage which brings up that kind of thing. Matthew 11, Jesus is talking about John the Baptist. He's been asked about John the Baptist, and I only have a bit of it here. But to what can I compare this generation? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you, but you did not dance. We sang the dirge, and you did not mourn. He's making fun of people. But here it is again. Pipe, mourn. So, just 2 books later, we get this reference again. So, think about it. You live in Palestine around the time of Christ. Someone dies in your household, and you're waiting for the flutist to come to play the music of mourning with you. Not when you get up, mourning, that kind of mourning. So, that tells me something about life in Palestine, which I'd never really thought about before. There are revealing things here. Okay, here Jesus is speaking about the end times. Well, what do we associate with the end times at all times? The trumpet shall sound, ba-dum, Handel told us that. But he got it from here. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn. No pipes here. When they see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. It's almost impossible to think of any other instrument being mentioned there except the trumpet. I suppose you could put a timpani or a drum there. But of course, that's not, timpanis have pitch, but drums don't have pitch. Trumpets have pitch. In other words, you play a little tune on them. Now on a shofar, you can't play anything except what you play on a bugle. But still, there are different pitches. So this is, a loud trumpet call, a fanfare. And I would hope there would be some kind of fanfare when this kind of thing is happening. There's a musical reference, but a very powerful musical reference to the notion of the trumpet. And when we get to Revelations, if we're just going to think about it this way, it's almost tiresome to see how many trumpets there are. But we'll go through that very quickly. This is, I think, perhaps my favorite musical reference in the New Testament. And it happens in Matthew, and of course Mark is very much like Matthew, and we'll see the verse from Mark is actually worded the exact same way. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Where are we? The Last Supper. They finished the Last Supper, which of course we call communion, but it was also their celebration of the Passover. And of course, you know, Jewish liturgical and devotional traditions go back thousands of years. And we may not know exactly what was going on, but apparently at this moment, Jews sing the last part of what they call the Hallel, which is Psalms 113 to 118, or Psalm 136. So if you have, obviously I've been Googling all kinds of things about music in the New Testament, and there was actually a question on Google, what is the last song Jesus ever sang? There's only one song we ever know Jesus singing, this one. Obviously it wasn't the first, man was 30 years old. But this is rooted in the tradition in which he grew up. So yes, the Last Supper is communion. But this reminds us that the Last Supper for them was also the celebration of the Passover. And this is how you end the Passover. So before Jesus goes out into the Garden of Gethsemane and gets arrested, he sang something from Psalms 113 to 18, or probably Psalm 136. Now, we don't know that for sure. But these traditions are centuries old, and that is probably. Now, is it a hymn? We'll talk about whether it's a hymn or not a little bit later. It's certainly a religious song. I'm not sure it would be a hymn. It has a specific definition. We'll get to that in just a moment. They go out to the Mount of Olives, and of course we all know what happens then, because we've been to a lot of Good Friday services. We go to Luke. There's a lot of texts in Luke that we sing today. And we'll be talking about those. I mean, there's three of them specifically that in other religious traditions are really important Christian traditions. But here, we're in the parable of the prodigal son, of course. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, which made him angry because music and dancing was for celebration. This was, of course, the major celebration that the father was throwing because the younger son, who'd gone out and wasted all that money and turned his life into a dissolute thing, had come home. We all know the meaning of the parable of the prodigal son, but what I think is fascinating here is he heard music and dancing. Well, when we celebrate today, we have music and dancing. So did they. One nice thing about studying the history of music is we find out that a lot of things about people really haven't changed that much. You know, I'm not an anthropologist. I can only believe what I read in anthropology, but what you often read in musical study is that anthropologists have never found a civilization in the history of the world that they've studied to whatever extent, and they haven't found music as part of it. Music really is basic to humans. There are no cultures without it. It might be used differently, it might be more functional, it might be more ceremonial, but there's music. And music is often part of fun. And this is fun. It's also the story of the prodigal son, but again, it's telling something about their lives. And their lives included music and dancing at celebrations, even when the older brother got angry. We go to Acts, which of course is also written by Luke. And this is again, it's revealing if we think about what the music is doing here. About midnight, Paul and Silas are praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Again, a very familiar place, because of course this is where the angel comes, and they get out of jail free. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake, the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everybody's chains came loose. Okay, so we have God's miracle, which gets Paul and Silas out of prison. But before that, they're in prison. I expect they're rather depressed. I expect they're quite worried about what's going to happen to them, as human beings would be. At the same time, of course, there's a great deal of faith, and what they are doing is praying and singing hymns. This is another really interesting, it's a conjunction we see in these references to music in the New Testament. Often there's some kind of text, praying, and there's also singing. Singing was clearly a basic part of their worship and devotional lives, because you didn't just pray, you also sang. And, texts become different when they are sung. They start to affect us in a different way. We hear them in a different way. And so do these people, who, after all, are, again, to the core, very much like we are. But we pray and we sing. And of course, we do this in our worship today. But we see that in their lives, that was a big part of it. If you were in a moment where obviously you were praying and singing to God, you were praying to God because you're in jail, you're also singing hymns. And again, what a hymn is, more on that in a moment. Paul mentioned music a good bit in his letters. Well, not a good bit, but he does talk about it. And he talks about it in kind of interesting ways. Accept one another, then just as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. For I tell you that Christ has become a servant of the Jews on behalf of God's truth, so that the promises made to the patriarchs, of the Jews of course, might be confirmed, and moreover that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. As it is written, reference to the ancient Hebrew scriptures. Therefore, while I praise you among the Gentiles, I will sing the praises of your name. This verse occurs basically in these exact words in 2 Samuel 22:50 and in Psalm 18:49. So, and of course, as we know, Paul is the one who brings the Christian message to the Gentiles. So he's more or less calling for that exact same thing here. And you're not only going to praise the Lord among the Gentiles, you're going to sing the praises of your name. Because of course, again, the music, the singing is a basic part of that worship, not just a nice thing to go with it. This is fascinating. How many times have we heard this verse? And did you ever think about it as an insult to music? If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. These are not nice references about a gong and a cymbal. What he's saying right here is those instruments are dead. There's nothing organic there. If you, whatever you might be doing, if you don't love, you're as useless as a gong that you just bang on for no reason. Or a cymbal, like you pick up a cymbal, hey, this would be fun. Make a loud noise. But the loud noise means nothing. What an interesting comparison to make. I mean, without love, you are a useless musical instrument. I'll tell you, when you play an instrument your whole life, thinking about an instrument as being useless is a little hard to do. But it's just, it's just talking about the importance of love, which I think we all understand. But, I've heard this verse 1,000 times in my life. I never thought of that. It never occurred to me that he was giving percussionists a backhanded slap. Corinthians, music comes up in Corinthians several times. Now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you and speak in tongues, what good will it be to you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge of prophecy or word of instruction? Even in the case of lifeless things that make sounds. There it is again. Instruments are dead. Such as the pipe or the harp. It gets very specific. How will anyone know what tune is played unless there is a distinction in the notes? Again, if the trumpet does not sound a clear call, who will get ready for battle? What are we talking about? Oh, I don't know. I remember when I was a little boy and I was trying to memorize the Guinness Book of World Records. Boy, was that a good time in my life. It said that the most boring piece of music ever written was 80 measures of middle C played at each quarter note. I think that's enough. It makes the point. That's the kind of music we're talking about. There is no distinction in the notes there. It's really boring. What brings music to life? Humans bring music to life. The players, the listeners. Without listeners, I'm the person playing it here, isn't it? But other people do not. Otherwise, it is lifeless. A lifeless thing. I just, as a musician, I find that to be a fascinating reference. There has to be some revelation or prophecy or word of instruction. Otherwise, it's like a lifeless instrument. And we really get specific here. We go after the woodwind players and the harpist. Unless there's some purpose there, it's lifeless. Just very later in the same book. For this reason, the one who speaks in tongue should pray that they may interpret what they say. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So what should I do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I will sing with my understanding. Again, we're associating prayer and singing, and we're saying that there has to be something. Speaks in tongues should pray that they may interpret what they say. There needs to be understanding. Pray with understanding. Sing with understanding. Don't just babble. Don't just say things that you're not thinking about. If you want to give glory to God, you have to think about the meaning. And the meaning, again, comes in your prayer, your text, and it comes in your singing. And again, this association of praying and singing. It's a basic thing. I just think it's worth thinking about. Really thinking about and what Paul is trying to say here. What should we say, again, later in the book, what then should we say, brothers and sisters, when you come together, each of you has a hymn, or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. It's the same meaning. Again, we're calling for understanding of what we're interpreting, what we're praying about, and what we are singing about. The text, the meaning, the association that speaks about, the way with you're thinking about your relationship with God is the important part. But singing is part of it. The next book, well, if anybody knows Messiah, this is in The Trumpet Shall Sound. Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not speak, but we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. Slightly different translation, of course. Handel was using the King James, what he had in England in 1742. But for the trumpet shall sound, the dead will be raised from the perishable, and we will be changed. So we're at the last days again, and we have a trumpet, or a shofar. Boy, it sure would be interesting to hear Messiah done with a shofar. I'm not sure any conductor will take that on. Anyway. Okay. This reference in 1 of Colossians starts to take us to a greater depth, if you will, because there are various types of song described here. There's different words. Like most writers who aren't musicologists, the words aren't being used very carefully, frankly, because the words for psalm, well, let's read it first. Ephesians, very famous passage, especially if you like music. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. This is also sometimes translated spiritual songs. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, in some ways that sounds like a very basic praise. But what's fascinating for me is we have other people who are obsessed with music, like I clearly am, since it's all I ever teach a class on, psalms, hymns, and songs. So what are these things? Again, now, this is written in Greek. So what you have here is the Greek word for psalm, the Greek word for hymn, it's psalmnoi and hymnoi, and songs from the Spirit, or spiritual songs, like I said, is another translation. Paul said something very similar to the Colossians. Let the message of Christ dwell among you as richly as you teach, and admonish one another with all wisdom. Again, call for wisdom. Think through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. Very much a parallel passage. But there's plenty of disagreement among scholars. Did you know scholars sometimes disagree? What a thought! On what is meant by psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. These Greek words are used pretty much indiscriminately in the Bible. They don't, it does mean something. If a student wanted to drive me crazy, they could say, "Oh, I went to an orchestra concert last night. They played 4 songs. Were there any singers? No. Then there were no songs. What did they play? They played a symphony, they played a concerto, they played an overture, they played incidental music from a play, they played a genre. Tell me what the genre is that wasn't a song." But of course, in normal parlance, we use the word song all the time. I often listen to music on YouTube. I'm listening to a symphony, and it says there's 4 songs here. No, there aren't. There's 4 movements to a symphony. But it's just very indiscriminate use of musical terms that actually have a specific meaning. And the same thing's going on here. The people writing the New Testament aren't really making the distinctions that can be made. So what is a psalm? Well, we all know what psalms are. I taught, I think, a 5 or 6 week class on it a few years ago. Not that that was the definitive thing, but still, we've all talked about psalms. There's 150 rhymed, rhythmic, poetic texts in the Hebrew Scriptures. Excuse me, they are not rhymed. That's how we translate them. That's a mistake, sorry. I was thinking about other languages, because we often rhyme. Poetic texts in the Hebrew Scriptures, which were intended to be sung, and for centuries, have been not one of the, but really the most important source of texts for composers to set. In the Jewish tradition and in the Christian tradition, there is no more important text of religious music in the Judeo-Christian method, except the Psalms. But that's what the Psalms are, those 150 Psalms. How important are they in Christian worship? Well, think about this. You're a monk or a nun. You spend hours a day in the church chanting. We're in the Middle Ages, of course. I did my dissertation research at a monastery in Spain called El Escorial. If you visit Spain, you often go there because it's a huge building. It's a burial place of Spanish kings, and it's one of the most important buildings in Spain. But there's been a monastery there for years, and it was founded in the 16th century. And in the 16th century, once the thing was built, if it was a big feast day, you spent 15 hours a day in the choir. You heard me right. 15 hours a day. Eating and all the other jobs you had to do had to be done at other times. And they got you up in the middle of the night a couple of times, because you had 9 services a day. You had Mass, and you had 8 offices. And they were, at the time, they were an Augustinian monastery. And in that Augustinian tradition, they were Jerome-ites. They became Augustinian later on. It doesn't matter, of course, but they were Jerome-ites. And in their tradition, you chanted all 150 Psalms each week. Every word. Now, if you're going to have 56 services outside of the 7 masses that you have, it's not all that hard to sing 56 psalms. But every one of the words of those psalms, I mean, if you were a 50-year-old monk and you've been doing this since you were 17 years old, you basically have the Psalms memorized. Think about that. That entire book. Now, it was in Latin. Hopefully you understood it. But still, you basically have those texts memorized because you sang every one of them each week. I think this would be considered excessive by our parishioners today. But that is how significant the Psalms have been in obsessive Christian worship. So the Psalms themselves, again, they are rhymed, they're rhythmic, but that should say rhythmic. Not rhymed. In the Jewish tradition, they are not rhymed, but when we translate them and sing them, we often put them in rhymes. So that's what a psalm is. So what's a hymn? Well, been a number of different things, but in the Western tradition, and I'm talking here about Christian worship from the beginnings of our understanding of it, because there are a lot of Latin hymns. If you look through our hymnal, you'll find some texts of Latin hymns that go back to the 4th or 5th century. Things written by St. Ambrose or something, which have been translated into English. And some of our texts of hymns are 15, 1600 years old. But, you know, so it's a song of praise to God, which in the West, once the Catholics stopped worshiping entirely Latin, it's often been in the vernacular. And of course, for Protestants, it's always been in the vernacular. It's been in the language that you speak, so you can understand it. And it's didactic or evangelical in nature. So it's not, you're supposed to be thinking about the text, but if you've got people you're trying to convert singing that text as well, it's supposed to be teaching them about God and Jesus and all of those things. And musical form is often strophic. And what strophic means is you keep singing the same melody and you have different verses of text, which should sound familiar because that's what all of our hymns are. They're strophic. Each stanza is sung to the same music. That's not the same thing as a psalm. Psalms don't have strophes. Now, they tend to get sung. I mean, if you're chanting them in the choir for hours and hours, you're singing them to formulae. So it might start to sound like a hymn, but the lines are actually of different lengths, so the music is not the same. It's just similar. But in our tradition, and in many traditions, these are strophic songs. Not the same thing as a song. This last one, spiritual songs. What's a spiritual song? I mean, that sounds like it's a very general, or song of the Spirit. It's a very general classification. If you just want to talk about a spiritual song, I think a hymn or a psalm sounds like it could be a spiritual song. So if you back up your definition a little, you can use the same different things. So you get, you know, a very general interpretation concerning songs about religious feelings. But there is a specific meaning that a lot of Christian scholars and musicians have put to the term songs of the Spirit or spiritual songs, and that is the canticle. And there's 3 basic canticles in the New Testament which have had a huge influence on music in the church. Not so much our church, but there's other churches that use these all the time. And they are the Magnificat, Mary's song once she realizes that Elizabeth knows why she's there. Song of Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, who was made mute because he didn't believe God at first when he was told that his wife would have a child. And then the next time he gets to speak, when John is being presented in the temple, he has this nice thing that he says. And in the book, in the Bible, it just says that he said. But we've assumed for 2,000 years they sang. And we sing these texts all the time. That's the Benedictus, blessed. Magnificat means I magnify the Lord. The song of Simeon, of course, is the old man who's been hanging around in the temple for, 30 years or something, waiting for the Messiah to be brought there to be dedicated. And when he realizes Jesus is it, he sings what in Latin is called the Nunc Dimittis. You may dismiss your servant, Lord. I can die now. I've seen the Messiah. In Episcopalian worship, they talk about the Mag and the Nunc. Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, because they sing them all the time. And once we get through the books of the New Testament and their references to music, that's where we're going. See how these texts have been used in Christian worship. Any questions? I know I talk a lot. Thank you.
What was the basis, like the Church of Christ doesn't have music?
They have singing.
Well,
There's a church or denomination.
Yeah,
you can't
well, I
sing.
mean, I would call them extreme Calvinists.
Okay.
They just, and again, St. Augustine felt the same way. So did Bernard of Clairvaux. Music is just, it's too beautiful, it distracts people from the glory of God. They're not thinking about God, they're thinking about the music. I mean, it just, you know, we are not extreme Calvinists. We are Calvinists, but we don't accept Calvin's feeling about